unlike the United States of America, our musicians that are going to be the architects of rock music and take rock and roll and make it into rock music have, in many cases, had their apprenticeship in skiffle. Skiffle's slightly different to the rhythm and blues and rock and roll groups that exist in America at that time. But the truth is, there is a conflagration of English folk musicians, classically trained musicians, but most importantly, skiffle musicians, blues musicians and jazz musicians coalescing around London in the early 60s, some of them working in the beat groups, and these beat groups exist all over the country as well, but also working in the burgeoning session scene. It is within that cauldron, I believe, that British rock music is created. And by British rock music, we mean rock music. If you were to make a list of the most important bands in rock music history, whether it be the Beatles or the Stones or the Who or Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath or Judas Priest, these are all British bands. And so this story becomes very important for the history of popular music in its totality. On this video, myself and Ben Finlay, the historian, will be discussing the social and cultural influences on this very important and celebrated period in British history, the swinging 60s.
1958. The great, who was it? Was it Cyril Davis or was it the Ken Collier? Who brings over Muddy Waters? It was Chris Barber.
Chris Barber brings over Muddy Waters, yeah.
Now, Chris Barber is a British trad jazz musician. He brings over Muddy Waters. As we said on the episode before, everyone's expecting this sort of very respectful interpretation of rural blues, you know, Delta blues, and Muddy turns up with an electric guitar. Now, 1958, we also see, I think, a consolidation of British rock and roll, which has faffed around since 56. But I think obviously Cliff in the Shadows and Hank Marvin also emerging, and the British rock and rollers are all pushing that electric guitar forth. So what is the effect of the electric guitar on, you know, the sort of British youth and proto rockers that are out there? Can you describe that and the effect that these visiting blues musicians have on that group of people?
I think if we listen to the interviews and stuff and these people say firsthand, I mean, it's expressive, isn't it? The electric guitar brings something else that you won't get with an acoustic guitar, just in terms of sound, in terms of image as well. I mean, a lot of these players will point out, just Buddy Holly, just how good a Stratocaster looked on him. It's an amazing. It looks like, you know, everyone's so used to it. It's utterly ubiquitous now, but it looks like it's something from the space age, doesn't it? Particularly Fender guitars in comparison to an acoustic guitar. It brings this great big noise as well with it. For people in the blues boom, you know, people like your Claptons and stuff like that, it was a way of being able to express a form of soloing that, you know, would be disguised the limit later on, that when people really went forward with it in the late 60s and 70s. So there's a form of expression there as well. There's a form of rebellion, and it's something that your parents won't have played before, an electric guitar. So it just becomes the whole symbolism behind it, I think. Yeah.
So do you think there is quite there's a cultural shift where a generation of older brothers and sisters and younger brothers and sisters, the older brothers and sisters have all come up, you know, studying this skiffle and blues. Maybe they're into trad jazz. They might even like Dave Brubeck. There's that era.
Yes.
And then the younger brothers are coming up and going, well, yeah, but I just want to play this electric guitar. And the Shadows are coming out, and there is like a second generation.
Yes.
that are interested in this, but for them it represents something really different. Now, I would like to look at the sort of the approach that the British had to rock and roll, because it takes a while to get going. There's modern jazz groups that say, "Oh, sod it, let's just jump in and join in like that." But I think Hank Marvin and the Shadows, and then Larry Parnes emerges and really creates this very unique British take on rock and roll with these sort of manufacturers, pop stars like Marty Wilde and Billy Fury, Johnny Gentle, and a whole host of people with strange sort of what are they verbs to their surnames.
It brings all of that in. But I mean, and I suppose that's a real attempt to ape the American stuff as well. As we were talking in the other video about, you were saying about Elvis being essentially a matinee star. It's bringing that element in it. So it's in this pre sort of Beatles period. You've got this stuff it's deliberately aimed at a mass consumption, I would say, whereas the blues, those sort of things, skiff, they weren't. So you've got a breaking away from that subculture. So that changes essentially what entertainment is in this country. It rolls. There's interesting as well, because the Jack Parnell stuff, all of that era, that rolls forward. And I remember years later when you started seeing, what was it, X Factor and those sort of things coming in. I was like, bloody hell, we've sort of gone back to the early 60s here of having this sort of manufactured, reasonably good looking people that you can sort of turn out what the producers want to do, with a big Svengali like Simon Cowell acting that sort of part. And I thought, well, that's how we've gone full circle, really, isn't it? That's sort of the end of innovation, because it soon goes, doesn't it? Once you've got an advert, something else, they've gone.
I think this conversation is going to be the key one, because there is a lot to cover here. I think we've set the scene of this new exciting rock and roll, electric guitars, Billy Fury, people with cool haircuts. That's all starting to emerge, which the skifflers and the trad jazzers didn't have so much. It's cooler. It's not like, does your chewing gum lose the flavour on the bedpost overnight? Where, Lonnie Donegan was so important to this, but he had spotted some of the humour in Lead Belly's sort of children's songs that he also sung, and he was able to push that. So it's an extension of how much is that doggy in the window and that earlier idea of popular music, right?
Yeah.
But in the UK, there culturally and politically, there's two things. 1956, right on the rock and roll coming, we get Suez, don't we?
Yeah, the Suez crisis.
And then that's followed up by the era of You've Never Had It So Good. That's when the affluence does kick in. Can you give us that background? That's what you're here for, Ben, is to give us that background.
Yeah, without going into Suez too much, obviously that is was a huge diplomatic sort of crisis that made us look. It essentially made us look silly to the rest of the world, and there is links between us and the 60s as in terms of where we sit in the world. We think America's going to back us. They're not that so interested in that one at all. And so it ushers in. So you've had Churchill, you get Alex Douglas home, and then you get the next prime minister, a next Conservative prime minister, who is famous for that saying, "Never had it so good," which is the names of various history books by Dominic Sandbrook and so forth. And he comes in 56, 57.
So this is Harold Macmillan, who is a very sort of stuffy, old school prime minister.
Real
overseeing the first period of affluence, really, after the war. Is this right? Yeah,
real spike in affluence that you see. So on the back of having, a mixed economy, to having a welfare state, having all of these things we start to lift economically as well. So that, as I said, the 50s is this sort of precursor to everything, and it lifts during that time. So by the late 50s, you have that coming in, and so there is a definite far more security for people as a backup to be able to be able to get into these things and to create the conditions for artistic.
My dad said if you wanted a week off, say 58, 59, you basically jacked your job in on the Friday, had the week off, and then went back on the Monday, went down and got yourself another job.
Yeah, I know. But my grandparents told me that you could just literally just skip go and find something else. And that push for full employment that was integral to all of the parties there as well was really very important. The fact that you had to have a job, you had to be part, and you had to be part of the economy as well. Other stuff's going on with it in terms as well, just in a bigger point of view, is that we've committed to decolonisation. The Macmillan government are also a big part of that. He goes to Africa in 1960, does the Winds of Change speech as well. So even though this is a very, very tweedy old, as I say, patrician conservative, this is laying the path for the 60s and a view of Britain that we have now. Everyone talks about decolonisation. It's one of the themes that we still look at, but the Conservative government there, or particularly Macmillan, is...
So both sides of the political spectrum, it seems that people are future-looking. They have that little bit of the idea of the Aquarian age, that there's going to be a wonderful...
It's a glimpse of it, yeah.
A glimpse of it. That's fascinating that is going on. My wife's father... He's that generation, born in 1939, grown up listening to Mario Lanza and all that stuff coming from America.
Yeah.
And rather than just stay in this town and do what everyone else does, he goes down to London. He gets a job, and because he's singing, he was a waiter in a restaurant, and he happens to be singing. He sings to all the customers, and one of the customers in this restaurant happens to be Huey Green's mother. Now, Huey Green ran the Opportunity Knocks talent show. She rang up Huey Green. My father-in-law sung to him over the phone. He was then put on the radio version of Opportunity Knocks. He won it. He got a deal with Decca Records and signed with Larry Parnes. Mm-hmm. And so he was then put on this incredibly important tour that happened through 60 and 61. It was actually a collection of tours where Larry Parnes put the sort of British contingent of the Billy Furies and the Marty Wilds and all those on with two American rock stars, genuine American rock stars, which was Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran. My father-in-law was on it, and before he died, he told me extensively what was going on. And when they played, I think it was the Liverpool Empire, the Beatles were in the building, and the Beatles were big fans of all the people that were on. And the Beatles actually said, look, we've got a tour of Scotland to my father-in-law. Do you want to do it? And my father-in-law said, no, you're not good enough. Because at that point, the virtuoso level in the musicians, like the Shadows and people like Joe Brown, was incredible skill level.
Yeah.
So my father-in-law had an incredible band at that time. And I think people forget this, that rock music's birthed out of that session scene in the early 60s, not the beat bands who didn't have so much virtuosity. There was a...
And I don't think the Beatles had not been to Hamburg in that time and really worked on their...
Not quite. This was 1960, and then they did pick up a tour of Scotland. They didn't even have Pete Best on drums, I've been told. It was someone else got the gig.
Before Pete Best, yeah.
And they took Johnny Gentle instead. And so my father-in-law, one of his claims to fame, was the fact that he didn't do the tour with the Beatles. His other claim to fame was being there when Eddie Cochran died in the car crash after that gig in Bristol in 1960 or 61. But these tours, Americans are coming over, and you've got the blues guys coming over, you've got the rock and roll guys coming over, and later on you have those soul tours coming in. And so, and I think there's all sorts of issues with them, the Americans not being able to bring over their musicians, or there has to be swaps, because of their stupid music union rules.
Well, there was music union ban on visiting musicians for years, and this is, I mean, even in the jazz scene, when you start getting the modern jazz scene at the end of the 50s, and Ronnie Scott's club is, it's a deliberate. He wants it along the lines of an American club, and he wants American artists to visit Britain as well. So you've got that influx of creativity going on at the same time as well. So the Americans are visiting, and anyone with an ear is going along and listening and absorbing this stuff. And it must always try and, as much as possible, put yourself back there. How inspiring that must have been to come out of where we were after the war, of the austerity in this country, and of the really rigid class system, and the expectation you're just going to, there were no teenagers. No, there was a teenage scene, in the 30s, but not like this before, that you could express yourself in this way, and but it was, you grow up, you're going to go to school, you're going to get a job, and that's it. And now something else comes along. So this is intoxicating for that generation. If you're going to be there, you're going to be on it, aren't you? So
Now, I have no idea how this works. I know we have that sort of very conservative Macmillan government that's brought a lot of affluences, delivered on the promise of what the left were saying at the end of the war.
yes,
But there is a movement over to another great Labour government, isn't there, in the 1960s? When does that happen?
that takes some time to come in. So you basically Wilson doesn't come in until 64. I just got to remember that some Anthony Eden was the prime minister before Macmillan. This home is before Harold Wilson. So Wilson comes in on a sort of on a small ticket in 1964. He doesn't get a particular huge majority, but he is. So the Labour government have been out of power for a long time. They've been out, for 13 years.
And I think this is really the bit. I mean, we've described what a lot of other people have described, a lot of the books describe. But in the same way, I was fascinated by how the National Health Service and that Clement Attlee government provided a very specific place for skiffle and rock and roll. And now we have this army of kids that have learned to play guitar, and they're either modern jazzers, or they might be into the flamenco, or they're into folk music, or they're into rock and roll, or they're into the blues. And they're all going down to London. And there is a session scene down there which is taking up all the really great players. This is where your John McLaughlins and your Jack Bruces and your Ginger Bakers, all through Alexis Corner and then later John Mayall. And then you've got the beat groups emerging, which would be the Beatles, the Kinks, the Rolling Stones and the Who. All that's going on. But those of us who have studied the thing that happens in the UK, where suddenly it goes from being rock and roll, it goes from being novelty music, it goes to, genius people like Joe Meek, but they're trying to have hit records. And then suddenly the Kinks come out with You Really Got Me. And then, the Rolling Stones come out with I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Suddenly there's a transfer over from pop music to rock music. Now, I'm a fan of rock music. And the ground zero, the changeover year is 1964.
Yeah.
And so this shift that happens in the UK, this ushers in the swinging 60s, the swinging London era.
Yeah.
This is the Harold Wilson government. Now, I know this is your real sphere of expertise.
The Harold Wilson.
This is your chance to deliver it to the world. What's going on politically and culturally that is backing this change up in the UK?
Well, the form of the conservatism we see is in terms of characters, particularly like Macmillan. The Tweedy old school stuff is sort of broken apart by the Profumo affair back in '63 as well. It's seen that.
Just describe what the Profumo affair is.
So you had Christine Keeler, who was obviously knew of the Conservative MP. Also keeping up with a Russian figure at the same time, and so and then he lies about it.
So Profumo basically is our politician. He's having sex with basically a call girl who's also sleeping with a Russian diplomat. And then he says it never happened. And this is fascinating to me. The Profumo affair really seems to puncture our British respect for the upper classes, the sort of stewards of the British political system. In the war, we do what Churchill says because he's a knob, and I mean that in a sense of he's, born in, wherever it was, Where was he born? Where was Churchill born? In the great big that great big house he was born in. I hate it when I lose flow.
No, I can't. But
It's named after it's Blenheim, right? So so Churchill, the sort of descendant of John Churchill, who was awarded a bigger house than the king had, Blenheim Palace. He's born into that. He believes that he's destined to save the United Kingdom, which he does, and the British public in 1940s follow them in totally. When Churchill stands up and says, "We're going to fight to the death. We're not going to, give in to the Nazis. You're all going to die, or we beat the Nazis," and they all go, "Yeah." This is an incredible thing. But by the 60s, the Profumo affair happens, and those people who had come out of the war had created in the arts a quite anarchistic comedy stroke satire, which starts with the Goons. By the 1960s, you've got That Was the Week That Was. And there is a
Peter Cook, Dudley Moore, all of those come out that the Establishment Club, where they really lampoon this stuff. That this is not this doesn't wash anymore. There's something else going on. So again, it creates that condition. There's an irreverence. The beginning of the satire boom, as you say, around that time. Private Eye. Well, that really lays the foundations of stuff for like alternative press later on.
I've got the records because my parents had the records. I've got the Goons records and I've got the Peter Sellers records. Right, I listened to them since I was a child. Right, when I hooked up with John Penny, who's the lead singer of Ned's Atomic Dustbin, and we got chatting. He's exactly the same age as me. Ned's Atomic Dustbin was a episode of the Goons. This is how much influence it had on a generation that goes right up to the 1980s. Now, those albums, the Peter Sellers albums, there are two satires. There's a satire of Lonnie Donegan, where he comes out and goes, "I'm hammering this wheel, and sometimes when I'm hammering this wheel, sometimes I hit my leg, and I hit my leg, and I got a leg shaped like a wheel." There's all that madness. And there is also a satire on the Larry Parnes boys.
Right.
And when they brought the Larry Parnes tribute album on, they had all those, including my father-in-law, all the records were on there. And then they also had that lampoon, of this black guy. "Well, yeah, my name is Vince," and all this stuff going on. Now, those records they're so ahead of their time in terms of, it's like listening to a film. Yeah. You've got orchestras playing classical music that then moves into Frank Sinatra big bands, and then the next thing you've got like Lonnie Donegan, and you've got like sound effects. Now, all those albums are created by George Martin, so there's a direct. I don't think the Americans had it. The Americans never had the Goons and the George Martin to then take.
No, you had sort of smart sort of comedy. Mickey Takes people like Tom Lehrer. That was a favourite of Princess Margaret, apparently. Just one of those little things I picked up along the way. But that sort of stuff, but you didn't have that form of British irreverence. That's that particular humour that we have. And it, as you say, it bursts out in '63, and this was the week that was all of it. It's like everything that has come before is being pushed back. We're going against this, and this idea. So the Wilson government comes in and runs on this white heat of technology, this scientific.
So they're the futuristic government, aren't they?
They're futuristic. Yeah.
Well, the thing is that you would expect there to be then some sort of anti-Eden type, handsome, future-looking, and we haven't. We got Harold Wilson.
Yeah, he plays. Yeah, well, but extremely able. Here we go. But extremely able politician. Worked on the Beveridge Report as well. Extremely good with economics. Was an Oxford Don by the time he was 19. Works his way up from a working class lad to that in that time. Sits in the Labour government and the Labour backbenches, and by the time he comes in 64, he's ready to go, and they run on that ticket, and you have extremely able politicians around him as well. So you've got Tony Benn in his sort of first sort of incarnation as more of a technocratic, white-coated sort of very efficient cabinet minister before he discovers Marxism and goes really left-wing at the end of the 60s. You've got people like Roy Jenkins, who goes on to become the most liberal reformist
great
Home Secretary we've ever had. You know,
one of the greatest Home Secretaries.
You've got Barbara Castle there, who's unbelievably talented and driven and dynamic. So you've got all of that stuff to go forward on it. Now, obviously, Wilson is inheriting still a set of problems, and the underlying problem of it, as much as on this surface affluence, and we've got the welfare state and everything, we don't still have a lot of money. It's underneath the surface, but it doesn't matter at the time. In this period, this is not overtly apparent to the masses, as it were. So so you concentrate on in London as this becomes this mecca of cultural and musical sort of innovation. And then the Americans start to report back on that, obviously, don't they? With the Time magazine, with the Swinging London edition. You know, historians, we talked about this sort of stuff, and I've read a lot of this before, talk about Swinging London and all of this stuff, and a lot of people go, oh, it happened on either side, on the conservative side or on the left of it, will say, oh, you know, it happened to 12 people in 1960. But it's the longer lasting effect and the effect of the optimism, and that no one's telling you can't. That and it creates this ferment, and I suppose it's all to do as well. Every year, if you look in the 60s through to the 70s, the rate of change is unbelievable. Even when we were just talking about Jimmy Page earlier, you know, so that's 55. I was watching that the other night, and I was thinking, bloody hell, it's not too long until he's like, you know, he's writing Days to Confused, and he's, you know, and he's Jimmy already in the new Yardbirds or before Zeppelin. It's such a small amount of time, and I think it's all to play for that. It's
incredible. So those of you who want to sort of try and understand the change that goes on, if you were to take 1964, it's like another realm of music's opened up with the Kinks. You Really Got Me.
Yeah.
You know, that riffage is coming from American blues, but there's something immediate by that. But when we listen to You Really Got Me, it's very similar to Louie Louie, which was an original rhythm and blues hit with the riff on piano. It's the guitar that makes it, but in reality,
distortion, isn't it? As well,
it's a representation of sort of teenage aggression in that sort of very middling guitar sound. Great, but it's still incredibly twee. Now you go 2 or 3 years into the future, and suddenly you come up against Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix, and then you go 2 years after that, and you have 20th Century Schizoid Man by King Crimson. That 5-year trajectory is how much culture changes. What's happening politically is this. Is the Wilson government leading the way? Because what's interesting is these rock stars that then emerge, they all come out as this sort of cheeky, chappy, sort of, or the great unwashed in terms of the Rolling Stones, working class reaction to the sort of Frank Sinatras that had gone before. But by the end of the 1960s, the Beatles are singing Taxman, and they've all absconded, haven't they, with their vast wealth?
Yeah, I mean, that goes on. I mean, the taxation is high. I mean, it's not as high as when you get when Wilson returns in '74. We're jumping ahead of ourselves there, and the famous Dennis Healy quote, you know, tax the rich till the pips squeak. But high taxation is part of the post-war consensus.
Yeah,
no one's expecting rock and pop stars to come along when that's sort of formulated in the mid 1940s. There's other stuff, I think, that the things that stand out to me, that's obviously going to stand from that Wilson government, is this huge wave of liberalization that you get in the mid 1960s. You know, the abolition of hanging, the pill, the decriminalization or partial decriminalization of homosexuality bill that goes through. You got the race relations first, you know, laws that go through in '65.
That's what it is, and I hadn't thought about that, but you've just filled that in. There must have been such a rate of cultural change where the old guard are going, well, you know, all the queers do what they want now, and there's all that going on, where the young people it really is fostering our very own British Woodstock, Age of Aquarius, you know.
Well, I always measure how historically how profound these things are by the backlash from whoever's the opposition to it. So if the conservative side or people people like Peter Hitchens would be up against it now. I used to always do a class called I do lots of stuff on the 60s, and we talk about the Wilson governments and the Jenkins reforms and the counterculture, all of that stuff. And then I do one called the 60s and his malcontents, the people that don't like what happened in the 60s. And there's a lot to criticize, you know, that the cheap housing that went up at the time. Just prior to Wilson, the beaching, you know, this sort of like real negation of some of those railways, the closure of loads of railway lines. As I said, the housing, those sort of things. There, you know, there's some short-termism that goes on in there. There's such a push to make this stuff work that, you know, there's stuff that's open to sort of corruption, particularly in the housing things and the contracts there. But the main things of the liberalisation, the bigger picture, it's very different than if you'd lived, say, in somewhere like in France. So, like in France in '68, when they're out the streets throwing rocks and it's all of that sort of stuff, they still have de Gaulle in charge. It would be like having like Churchill on steroids in charge in Britain. We had a nice Home Secretary in Roy Jenkins, and you have people like David Still that had put all of these things through.
That's fascinating. Because the other thing is this new era that our government is pushing in. Maybe I mean, America had Kennedy, who promised all this, but when Kennedy died, Johnson comes in. Then they're moving towards Nixon, and they're moving towards this sludge of the Vietnam War.
Well, the Vietnam
Britain,
War.
We're not like it's still very British. It never in fact, it becomes more British. Yeah. And so the sort of stately home is replaced by the mini and the Italian job.
And we stay out of Vietnam, which really ultimately does. We just mentioned Johnson after JFK. He has this idea of a great society in America. The trouble if it's implementing all of this stuff is that, you know, you've got the Vietnam War going on all the time. Wilson basically keeps us out of that. He doesn't go dead against the Americans because, as this is one I always used to say as well, whether he said this or not, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but he basically said, I'm not outrightly going to say anything because you don't kick your creditors in the balls. Which is you can imagine it.
You really rate him, don't you, as a prime minister? You really rate Harold Wilson. I can tell that he negotiated a path through this, and
not perfect. You know, not a perfect. No one is.
No, but he didn't fall into the trap of that utopian leftism. He seems to have been a very down to earth guy, very educated. And very down to earth, and he did play that as his image, didn't he?
He played that, you know, and you know, I'd like tinned salmon and pints of beer, but I mean, he liked a brandy and a cigar, really. Yeah. But it didn't matter. He was a sort of centre ground social democrat, and you know, he was very clever as well. So and it worked for him. But he got in with the, you know, he was there presenting stuff to the Beatles, and he'd get involved in that sort of stuff, but. You know,
we did it right. This country, the thing I've realised is that we negotiated the 60s right. Mm. The British did it right. You think of America, and it's like the youth they're revolting against all these things. The French are revolting it, and the rest of the world hasn't got it. No, but the British get it right, and it's bizarre that Harold Wilson, with his bloody hat and his little pipe, actually was able to negotiate this new vision of the world and not get in the way of it.
No, he doesn't get in the way at all. He's very good at as you said, negotiating, getting his way around it all. And yeah, you know, that you could look back at any prime minister. All these people are criticised at the time, but. It's a very different thing. Just going back to like the Time magazine, the American view of us as well. You know, when Dean Acheson, the American politician, you know, said we'd lost an empire and we hadn't really found our place in the world or worlds along that line. What we do is we fill that with our popular culture, that export, that British invasion, that what we send back to America in such a short amount of time is where we find something else, and it's cultural values. I think there's all of that in a strange way, and without getting political about today, wheels through to where we are now. There's a completely changed. You could what were the Beatles all about? It was, it's cool, do what you want to. Yeah, we're all laid back. We're imposing rules on anything. Do your thing, whatever. And particularly the Stones as well. There's a relaxing of two standard morals that it's all right. It all goes along. There's loads of it. Back to Penguin Books in the 30s, and then the Lady Chatterley's lover trial in 1960. And everyone can read this stuff that only belonged to the rich people, that was in bound books on your shelf.
Yeah.
Now you could pick it up anywhere, and you were part of it. And so Penguin Books, after Lady Chatterley's lover, after that trial, it's like now you can read it. Became this era of individualism as well. It is about you. You are part of it. It's democratized, and so you get this, as if for want of a better phrase, golden age of time. And of course, people could express themselves. The record companies gave the money to do so as well. You could get signed.
And I think there's also a very English sort of anarchism in the culture, which means that when the police are trying to nail the Rolling Stones for drug taking, it's not seen as shocking. It's seen as very funny.
Yeah, the news of the world. Yeah, when they go down to Wittering and arrest Keith and Mick and that, but it's done in this weirdly salacious way of Marianne Faithfull done up in a rug wearing no clothes.
Yes,
and it's just it's funny when you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, there's in no way is it going to destroy their career. They will emerge, the Stones, completely unscathed, because those sort of tactics nobody cares about. And even our gangsters have become pop stars. We've got the Cray twins, and they're going about killing people and doing stuff. But
you've got the Times. You've got the Times. Who breaks a butterfly in a wheel? William Rees-Mogg, father of Jacob, writes that and does an interview as well with Jagger when they're released. When they don't really do any time in prison, they do it. But Keith said the wine list wasn't very good. All that sort of stuff.
It's all of that, isn't it? Yeah.
It's all of that, and it's all very irreverent. It reminds me in some ways of when we try and bring this back in the 90s, when there's this sort of the great 60s revival of that sort of cheeky, irreverent humour. And so if you've got William Rees-Mogg and the Times saying, listen, this draconian sort of laws are ridiculous, this is overstated, there's a shift. There's a shift happening.
It's a shift. So now we're at the back end of the 60s, and I think we now have to move on to the period of music which is loved and beloved on this channel. It begats progressive rock, and it begats jazz rock fusion, and a very sort of British take on those, which does seem to fall out of favour. I'm really interested in exploring on that, but of course we have to now move on to the next episode. So you're all going to have to wait till tomorrow to see where this goes, and how we go from the cheeky chappies and the Beatles to some very, very upper middle class man ensconced in some manor house somewhere making tubular bells. And we're going to really focus, I think, on Mike Oldfield.
Yes,
I believe he's such a new kind of pop sensation, if you could call him that. And the era of the hi-fi, and the era of the film for your ears, which I think is been lost a little bit culturally, completely since then. So Ben, thank you for that. Let's get on to the next one, shall we?
Yes, indeed.